I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 4, Sunday, March 22nd, 2026. The lesson is entitled, Jesus Prepares for Death. Lesson text comes from Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 52. Related scriptures are Psalm 75, 6 through 8, 88, 1 through 8, Jeremiah 25, 15 through 29, Matthew 6, 9 through 13, Mark 10, 32 through 34. The place is Jerusalem. The time is between 26 and 30 A.D. In the first unit, we studied the bad news that God's wrath is stored up for us in judgment because of our wickedness. We learned that his wrath is perfectly just and that no one can escape his condemnation through his or her own apparent righteousness. That leaves us with a few questions. Can anyone be saved? And if so, is God unjust for removing his wrath on them? This week's lesson answers those questions. God provided salvation through his Son, Jesus Christ. He did so not by simply removing his wrath from us and ignoring our sin, but by satisfying his wrath in Jesus' sacrifice. Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath to save us. Today's aim, facts. To know what happened in Gethsemane from Jesus' prayer of preparation to his betrayal and arrest. Principle. To understand that Jesus' betrayal and arrest was no accident. It was part of God's plan of salvation to satisfy his wrath and provide eternal life. Application. To turn to Jesus and believe in him, recognizing that salvation comes through him alone, for he drank the cup of God's wrath for us. Illustrating the lesson. Either we can turn to Jesus for salvation, who drank the cup of God's wrath in our stead, or we can reject Jesus and drink the cup of God's wrath on our own. There are no other options. Practical points. 1. It is sometimes appropriate to be deeply sorrowful. Mark 14, 32 through 34. 2. We should worship Jesus for what he willingly endured for our sake. Verses 34 through 36. 3. We should pray earnestly and directly, yet we must submit to God's will. Verses 35 through 36. 4. We should pray that we may not enter into temptation. Verses 37 through 42. 5. Difficulty and temptation will come to all of us. Verses 39 through 42. 6. We cannot truly discern the hearts of others. Verses 43 through 49, verses 18 through 19. 7. We should never doubt what Jesus has said. Verses 50 through 52, verses 27 through 31. Golden text. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. Mark 14:36. Today we have 4 lesson outlines. The first is Jesus prays, Mark 14:32 through 34. The second is Jesus' prayer, Mark 14:35 through 36. The third is the disciples' rest, Mark 14:37 through 42. And the fourth is Jesus is betrayed and abandoned, Mark 14:43 through 52. Introduction. This quarter's first unit was on God's wrath on sin. Now we turn to God's wrath poured out on God's Son. In today's passage, Jesus prepares to take the bitter cup of God's wrath in our place as our substitute. Because Jesus bore God's wrath for us, we can find safety and security in him. Jesus' humanity was on display as he trembled at the awful prospect of suffering the punishment for the sins of the world. Yet, despite his fear, he prayed and prepared in perfect obedience to his Father. As we see Jesus preparing to die, and as we prepare to celebrate resurrection morning, let us marvel at his perfect obedience in the face of his unparalleled death. Let us worship him with reverence and awe for what he endured. As Mark's gospel so clearly depicts the severity of God's wrath poured out on Jesus, let the account also serve as a warning. Do not casually dismiss Christ for another day. God's wrath is severe. Do not foolishly think you can save yourself, for if you do, you too will experience God's wrath. Instead, put your faith in Christ, who has already taken God's wrath on sin. Jesus prays, Mark 14:32. And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he saith to his disciples, sit ye here while I shall pray. Verse 33. And he taketh with him Peter and James and John, and began to be sore amazed and to be very heavy. Verse 34. And he saith unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. Tarry ye here and watch. In these verses, we see Jesus' humanity clearly displayed. Jesus was greatly distressed by what awaited him the following day. He not only experienced sensations like taste and touch, sight and smell, but he also experienced real emotions as well. The legitimate and justifiable dread awaiting him is palpable in these verses. Jesus took the disciples to Gethsemane. There were only 11 apostles now, for Judas had already left them. He seated them and brought 3 of them farther. That was not the first time Jesus brought Peter, James, and John to see something the others did not. Mark 5:37. They alone saw him when he was transfigured. 9:2. Now Jesus brought them further with him in the garden. Whether that was because they were his closest friends or because he was intentionally preparing them for leadership roles in the early church, or both, we do not know for certain. James was an early martyr, Acts 12:1-2. Peter was the prominent leader in the early church, chapters 1-12, and John was the longest living apostle. They were all leaders in the early church. After taking these 3 a little farther, Jesus told them to wait as well. Going on his own, he fell on the ground and began praying. This was not like a Renaissance painting where Jesus is depicted kneeling serenely in the foreground with a halo. He was not serene. He was deeply distressed and troubled. Mark, who wrote the shortest gospel and was often succinct, used multiple words to emphasize how troubled Jesus was. Jesus himself said that he was troubled to the point of death, Mark 14:34. He knew what awaited him, and he felt dread and revulsion at what was coming. When Jesus declared that he was sorrowful to the point of death, it was not an empty, melodramatic flourish. Jesus never spoke that way anywhere else in the Gospels. This was a uniquely terrible experience in his life. Knowing what was coming, Jesus was grieved, After his arrest, things would happen at a rapid pace, a whirlwind of activity. But this was the calm before the storm, a moment for him to reflect and agonize over the horror of what was about to unfold. He would suffer a horrible death and bear the wrath of God poured out against sin. No wonder he was sorrowful to the point of death. Jesus' prayer, verse 35. And he went forward a little and fell on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Verse 36. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. Jesus' prayer was direct but humble. He was not coy, pretending that he did not have a preference how God answered him, but neither was he demanding. He had faith that all things are possible for the Father, yet he submitted to the Father's will. We can learn much from his prayer. What did Jesus mean when he asked that the cup pass from him? There are two clear options. The first is that Jesus was referring to the cup of God's wrath. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets repeatedly spoke of the cup of God's wrath that the wicked would be forced to drink. Isaiah 51:17 through 23, Jeremiah 25:15 through 29. The book of Revelation echoes this imagery, 14:9 through 10, 16:19. People generally take Jesus to be praying that he would not have to drink the cup of God's fury and wrath against sin. There is also a second possibility. It could be that the phrase, this cup, was generally used for a person's lot or portion. This is why the book of Psalms talks about the cup of salvation, or calls the Lord the cup. 1:16-13, 16:5. Earlier in Mark, when James and John asked to be honored in Jesus' kingdom, Jesus asked whether they were able to drink the cup that he was going to drink. After they affirmed that they were, he agreed that they would drink the same cup, but said that the place of honor in the kingdom were for the Father to give. Mark 10:35 through 40. James and John did not drink the cup of God's wrath for the sins of others, so there were times Jesus used the cup to refer to what would happen to him more generally. But whether Jesus was praying to avoid drinking God's wrath poured out against sin, or whether he was asking to avoid the events that were about to happen, he clearly agonized over his upcoming death on the cross. Despite his confidence that the Father could take this cup from him and his deep desire that the Father do so, Jesus submitted. He accepted that the Father might have plans that were different from what he was asking for. Praying for something and then submitting to God's will does not imply a lack of faith. Rather, it demonstrates a recognition that God's plan might be better than what we have asked for, and that we trust his wisdom. The disciples rest, verse 37. And he cometh and findeth them sleeping, and saith unto Peter, Simon, sleepest thou? Couldest not thou watch 1 hour? Verse 38. Watch ye and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak. Verse 39. And again he went away and prayed and spake the same words. Verse 40. And when he returned, he found them sleeping again, for their eyes were heavy. Neither wist they what to answer him. Verse 41. And he cometh the third time and saith unto them, Sleep on now and take your rest. It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Verse 42. Rise up, let us go. Lo, he that betrayeth me is at hand. Jesus rebukes the disciples, Mark 14:37 through 38. When Jesus returned to the disciples, he found them sleeping. It was late. They were tired and it was dark. Although sleeping was understandable, it was not justified, and Jesus chided them. He also called Peter Simon, referring to him by his old name. Jesus had changed Simon's name to Peter, John 1:42, but sometimes referred to him by his old name. When he did this, it seems to have been a sign that Peter was behaving like his old self, or that he was about to. Luke 22:31, John 21:15 through 19. Falling asleep instead of praying earned him the gentle reminder of his old name. The cycle repeats, Mark 14:39 through 42. Jesus again encouraged the disciples to pray that they would not fall into temptation. This might have been a tacit lesson for them to reflect on later. Their failure to pray led to failure and sin. We can learn the same lesson. How often do we pray for the Lord to deliver us from temptation, as Jesus taught, Matthew 6:13? The cycle repeated. Jesus went and prayed only to return and find them sleeping. They did not know what to say to him, Mark 14:40. Likewise, because they were embarrassed and had no excuse for falling asleep again, Jesus prayed, making the same request as before. Although we should not mindlessly repeat words in prayer, Matthew 6:7 through 9, that does not mean that we should pray for something only once. Jesus demonstrated persistence in prayer, much like the widow in one of his parables, Luke 18:1 through 8. We too can go to God in prayer with the same request over and over. After he returned and woke them a third time, he told them that the hour had come. Throughout his ministry, Jesus had been keenly aware that his hour had not yet come. John 2:4, 7:30. He had not rushed toward this moment any faster than God had planned, but neither would he avoid it. He could have easily fled the garden after praying once. He could have fled the garden after praying a second time. No one forced him to stay and wait for Judas and the mob to arrive. It would have been easy for him to wake the disciples and head home to Galilee. But he was determined that if this was the Father's will, he would obey. Jesus is betrayed and abandoned. Verse 43. And immediately while he yet spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staffs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Verse 44. And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. Verse 45. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him. Verse 46. And they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Verse 48. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Are ye come out as against a thief with swords and with staffs to take me? Verse 49. I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and ye took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Verse 50. And they all forsook him and fled. Verse 51. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body, and the young man laid hold on him. Verse 52. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Jesus arrested, Mark 14:43 through 49. As Jesus was still speaking, Judas led a mob toward him. They were heavily armed, meaning they likely considered armed resistance possible. We know that the disciples had two swords, Luke 22:38. Judas would have known that, and the priests were not taking any chances. They wanted to make sure Jesus was dealt with. Judas had arranged a sign beforehand regarding how they would identify Jesus. This demonstrates that, unlike old paintings of Jesus, he did not have a glowing halo. He looked like the people around him. He did not have an extraordinary appearance or otherworldly good looks that made him easily identifiable, Isaiah 53:2. He blended in with the disciples, and unless someone had seen him before, they would not be able to identify him by his appearance. That might be why Judas had arranged a sign with them. Just as the armed crowd was to prevent Jesus from escaping by force, the identifying sign was to prevent Jesus from escaping by trickery. Perhaps the priests imagined that Jesus would not identify himself and allow one of the disciples to pretend to be him while he attempted to escape. As soon as Judas identified Jesus with a kiss, a somewhat common sign of respect at that time, possibly on the cheek, the crowd seized Jesus. In response, Peter tried to defend Jesus, although Mark did not name Peter as the one who struck back with a sword. John did. John even named the man Peter struck Malchus, a servant of the high priest. John 18:10. It is unlikely that Peter was trying to merely cut off Malchus's ear as a warning to everyone. More likely, he was untrained in how to use a sword and swung it wildly, barely hitting his target. In response, Jesus rebuked Peter and healed the wounded man, Luke 22:51. Then Jesus rebuked the mob for coming to arrest him with swords and clubs, and he accepted the Father's will. In response, the disciples fled. Jesus abandoned, Mark 14:50-52. What are we to make of the young man who fled naked? Who is he, and why is this detail included? The Bible does not say. We may speculate, but we do not know with total certainty. One popular theory is that this was Mark, the author of the gospel. If so, his refusal to name himself would be comparable to the way John repeatedly refused to name himself in his gospel, John 13:23-22. Circumstantially, evidence may support this idea. A linen garment would have indicated some level of wealth, and Acts 12:12 indicates that Mark's mother's house was a place of prayer for the early church. Since her house was chosen to host the church, it may have been large. Some even speculate that the Last Supper was in Mark's house, so perhaps Mark followed Jesus and the disciples afterward. However, while the idea that the young man is Mark is popular today, it is uncertain. Writing around AD 110 to 120, Papas wrote that Mark never heard Jesus, for he never heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, but wrote his gospel based on what Peter told him. While it is possible Papas was mistaken, we should be cautious to confidentially label Mark as the young man. While other guesses have been proposed, the identity of the young man is not important to the point Mark was making. Mark could have named this young man, but did not. Instead of speculating on what Mark did not say, we should focus on what he did say. This man fled naked. Nakedness is often often connected with shame in the Bible. Genesis 3, 7 through 11, 21, Amos 2:16. It is possible that Mark included this detail as a way of highlighting the shame of abandoning Jesus. Though only one man fled naked, all the disciples abandoned their master and fled. This was a shameful act. Yet, despite their great and abject failure, Jesus loved them and would restore them. John 12, 19 through 29, 21, 15 through 19. Mark and the other gospel writers were not interested in presenting a false, rose-tinted view of the apostles. They depicted them as they were, with all their faults and weaknesses. This detail is a mark of an event that rarely happened, not a legend spun by first century Christian charlatans. Questions. 1. As a man, what did Jesus experience as he faced death? 2. Why did Jesus bring Peter, James, and John farther than the other disciples? 3. How was this prayer unique in Jesus' life? 4. What was Jesus referring to when he prayed about this cup? 5. Why did Jesus pray that not his will but the Father's will be done? 6. Why might Jesus have called Peter Simon? 7. What do we learn from the fact that Judas had to arrange a sign to identify Jesus? 8. How did Peter initially respond to Jesus' arrest by the mob? 9. Is it important to identify the young man who fled naked? Why? 10. Why might Mark have included the detail about the young man fleeing naked? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, March 22nd, 2026. Thank you for listening. Please remember to click the subscribe tab. God bless.